Then came his witnesses. Officer Tierney was steady and brave, her voice never wavering as she detailed the basement archives. Lieutenant Vespera was relentless, her eyes daring the board members to blink first. Finally, Karis Leora's mother took the seat. I raised my daughter to speak up, she said, tears tracing lines down her cheeks. But when she did, your badge shut her down. She was silenced until Commissioner Solari listened, not as an officer, but as a human being. The room hushed. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs. Others glanced at each other, their pens hovering, suddenly unsure of what to write. They left hours later without fanfare. No verdict. No statement. Just the hum of politics wrapping itself back into procedure. Afterward, Maceo sat alone in his office, the weight of the day pulling at his shoulders. He looked at the photos on his wall, not the official commendations, but the personal ones. His wife. His young daughter. A wide shot of the candlelight vigil for the victims of the 8th name. He stared at the tiny flames frozen in the frame. So many lights had been snuffed out before anyone even noticed they were burning. He thought of Karis Leora, drenched in injustice on a dark rural road. He thought of Odelia, who swallowed her humiliation so her son wouldn't have to. He thought of Mayor Lasker, who stood tall when it would have been so much easier to bend. Was he the man he had hoped to be when he first pinned on the Silver Star? He didn't know. But he knew he was trying, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. When the state's report arrived 2 weeks later, he read it twice. There were no charges. There was no disciplinary action. There was also no praise. Just a single, sterilized line at the bottom of the page. Commissioner Solari's actions, while unorthodox, adhered to the ethical framework of necessary reform. He didn't frame it. He didn't need to. Praise was never the goal. Truth was. Elowen changed. Not overnight, but in the quiet, tectonic way cities do when they've been shaken violently awake. A younger, kinder intake officer manned the front desk. A vibrant mural went up in Elowen Square, abstractly honoring the 9 names on Maceo's list. Karis Leora wrote an op-ed that was printed, uncut, in the local Herald. Justice didn't politely knock on our door, Karis wrote. It walked in wet and angry, and dared us to finally listen. The rain cleared on a Sunday. Maceo sat on his porch, a mug of black coffee in his hand, watching the sun try to reclaim the bruised sky. Beside him, his 8-year-old daughter, Alara, sat cross-legged on the wood planks. "Did you win, Dad?" she asked softly. Maceo paused, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "No," he said. "But I didn't let them win, either." She nodded, her young face thoughtful. "Are you going back tomorrow? Even if they still don't like you?" "Yes," Maceo smiled, a genuine warmth reaching his eyes. "Especially then." That night, Maceo wrote a final note. It wasn't for the state board. It wasn't for the mayor, and it wasn't for the press. It was for Elowen. To every citizen who has ever felt unseen, I see you. To every voice that was silenced, I hear you. And to every badge that forgot what it stands for, I remember. He taped it inside the precinct's front lobby, right next to the security camera, so it could never be ignored again. The next morning, the local town hall filled with students for a community outreach program. A girl in the front row, no older than 10, raised a timid hand. "Why did that bad officer pour coffee on your mom?" she asked. The room held its breath. Maceo paused, then stepped off the stage and knelt right beside her chair to meet her at eye level. "Because sometimes, people in power forget the heavy weight of their own actions," he said gently. "But it is our job, all of our jobs, to remind them." The girl nodded slowly, processing the weight of it. Did she get justice? Maceo looked her squarely in the eyes. She got a voice. And sometimes, that's even more powerful. Silence protects power. But stories dismantle it. This wasn't just a tale of a ruined blouse and a viral video. It was a reckoning. And for the city of Elowen, it had only just begun. It wasn't just a report, it was a map of a decade-long conspiracy of silence. Each page was a life disrupted, a complaint ignored, a truth suppressed. Monday morning, the City Hall chamber was a tinderbox. Protesters stood shoulder to shoulder with retirees and students. When Mayor Lasker took the podium, she didn't read from a script. She held up the 71-page file. "My office received this last night," she announced, her voice echoing. 71 cases. 71 times the city looked the other way. "I stand with Chief Solari, and I reject the motion for a council-appointed committee. Oversight should not fear exposure, and justice should not fear the light." The vote was called. 5 hands rose against the motion. 2 abstained. The leash was snapped before it could be cinched. The victory lasted exactly 6 hours. At 2:14 p.m., the power in the precinct's east wing flickered and died. The server housing the complaint archives went dark. Vespera burst into Maceo's office. "It's a localized kill switch." Someone wiped the active intake logs before the backup kicked in. "Sabotage," Maceo muttered. It was a clear message: if you won't stop, we'll make sure you can't work. By evening, a new front opened in the war. A video began circulating on social media, a heavily edited clip from one of Maceo's internal briefings. Through clever splicing, it made him sound like he was admitting to targeting officers based on race rather than conduct. The comments flooded in like bile: #Solari witch hunt, #reverse profiling. "We traced the leak to Captain Harlan's terminal," Vespera said, her jaw tight. "The man who always told us we don't air family business in public." "Suspend him," Maceo said. "Immediately." But for every digital attack, a defense rose. A group calling themselves the Mothers of Elowen began posting their own videos, raw, unedited stories of the times they were ignored by the system. Jasmine Carter, the girl from the dashcam video, sat between her parents. "My voice was stolen once," she said to the camera. "Never again." Late Friday night, the Cold War turned hot. A Molotov cocktail was thrown through the ground floor window of Mayor Lasker's office. No one was hurt, but the charred remains of her curtains and the smell of gasoline in the carpet were a visceral warning. Maceo met her outside the crime scene as the fire trucks pulled away. The orange light reflected in his eyes, hard and cold. Lasker's hands were shaking slightly, but she stood tall. "This is what they do when they're cornered," she whispered, her voice like iron. "They try to burn down the house because they know they can't live in it anymore." Maceo looked at the scorched brick. "Let them light their fires. It only makes it easier to see exactly who's standing in the shadows." Maceo looked at the orange flames still licking the scorched edges of the window frame. "Then we hold the line." By Sunday, state officials had called for a formal inquiry into Commissioner Solari's leadership. A motion was introduced at the Capitol to review Elowen's rogue reform procedures. The union saw it as oversight. Mayor Lasker saw it as sabotage. Maceo saw it as a test. "How we respond in that room," he told Lieutenant Vespera, "is what they'll remember. Not just here, but in every precinct watching us. If we survive this, maybe we light the way for someone else." The rain hadn't stopped for days. It was the kind of gray, relentless downpour that soaked through skin and memory, turning Elowen's cobblestone streets into rivers and making time feel agonizingly slow. But for Maceo, it didn't slow anything down. He stood under the slate-colored sky, his boots planted firmly on the steps of the precinct, watching the raindrops snake down the glass doors like unanswered questions. The building looked exhausted. So did he. But he stepped inside, greeted by the harsh hum of fluorescent lights and the nervous murmurs of his staff. The state board was already seated in the main conference room. Clipboards in hand. No nods. No pleasantries. Just pens, protocol, and power. The room was clinical, the air was cold, and their eyes were colder. They fired their questions like a firing squad. Why bypass internal review procedures? Why suspend veteran officers without preliminary hearings? Why trust anonymous civilian complaints over decorated deputies? Maceo didn't flinch. His answers were measured, void of mechanics but heavy with conviction. Because what is kept internal is entirely invisible, Maceo replied, his voice a steady rumble in the quiet room. Because suspension is not a punishment, it is a prevention of further harm. And because anonymity does not mean untruth, it means fear. A fear this department built. The board scribbled. Maceo stood his ground. You manually killed the feed. Martin's jaw flexed. I was doing my job. Your job doesn't include erasing the truth, Maceo said. You're suspended, effective immediately. We're handing this over to the state's attorney. Martin kicked a chair aside as he stood. You're making a catastrophic mistake, Solari. No, Maceo said, leaning back. I'm correcting one. By afternoon, a new sheet of paper appeared on the bulletin board. Corporal Silas Martin, suspended pending felony investigation. That night, Maceo hosted an emergency forum at the community center. The room was packed to the rafters. A young woman named Caris Leora stood up in the third row. Her voice shook, but she didn't sit down. In 2017, I was the girl in that car, she said, holding up a printed still of her own terrified face. My brother was driving. He didn't fight. He didn't even raise his voice. Martin broke his ribs anyway. The official report said my brother was combative. Nobody believed us. She looked at the crowd, then back at Maceo. Until now. The silence that followed wasn't the suffocating kind from the cafe. It was the heavy, pregnant silence of a city finally exhaling. Later that evening, Maceo sat on his mother's porch swing. Odelia rocked slowly, her knitting needles clicking like a clock. I remember Caris, she said softly. She used to sell wildflowers by the church. I always wondered why she stopped smiling. Maceo looked out at the quiet street. She's smiling now, Ma. Good, Odelia said, patting his hand. Then the coffee was worth the stain. Maceo didn't offer a rebuttal to his mother's wisdom, he simply let the weight of her words settle. Odelia patted his hand, her touch light but grounding. Truth takes time, Maceo, she whispered, but it has a long memory. The next morning, the department woke up to a new reality. Maceo didn't call a press conference or issue a memo. Instead, he walked into the lobby with a roll of tape and a laminated sheet of paper. He tacked it directly beside the name of Corporal Silas Creel. It was a new mandate: every use of force incident would henceforth be reviewed by an independent civilian board within 30 days. A woman in a rain-slicked coat paused to read the bold print. She looked at the list of names, then at the new policy, and offered a sharp, knowing nod to the empty air. The ripples were already turning into waves. The call from Mayor Evelyn Lasker came at 6:42 a.m. No greeting, just the sharp intake of breath that signaled political panic. Chief Solari. My office. Now. By 7:30 a.m., Maceo was walking through the glass and steel corridors of City Hall. Aides swarmed like hornets, clutching tablets and espresso cups, their eyes darting toward him with a mix of awe and terror. Inside the executive suite, Mayor Lasker stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her silhouette sharp against the morning skyline. Do you know what my last 12 hours have looked like? She asked without turning. I can imagine, Maceo replied, remaining by the door. Calls from the district attorney. The Chamber of Commerce. Council members who have been comfortable for 20 years, she turned, her eyes dark with exhaustion. Not one of them wanted to talk about policy, Maceo. They all wanted to talk about you. If you're asking me to pull back the curtain more slowly, I'm afraid that's not an option. Lasker stepped closer, tapping 2 stacks of paper on her mahogany desk. The short stack is the letters of support from the public. The tall stack? Grievances from within your own building. Words like vendetta and betrayal are being thrown around like confetti. If exposing rot makes the people holding the shovel uncomfortable, Maceo said evenly, then I'm doing my job. Lasker sighed. I agree with the mission. Truly. But the council is scared. There's a proposal hitting the floor on Monday to establish an external oversight committee, one appointed by them, not you. They want to tie your reforms in a knot of bureaucracy until the public loses interest. They want a leash, Maceo countered. So they can bury the findings before the ink is dry. Lasker didn't deny it. They're rattled. If I'm going to go into that chamber and defend you, I need more than a viral video and a list of names. I need a systemic case. I need a pattern that makes it impossible for them to look away. You want a dossier for a war, Maceo said. She nodded. Give me the truth so loud they can't twist the narrative. Maceo returned to the precinct and locked himself in with Lieutenant Vespera. I need the full timeline, he told her. Every flagged case from the last decade. Excessive force, fabrication, verbal abuse, matched against the internal resolution stamps. By afternoon, the office felt like a war room. Vespera brought in 2 forensic analysts, their keyboards clicking in a frantic rhythm. By midnight, the file had reached 71 pages. At 2:45 p.m., a courier delivered a certified envelope from the police union. The language was surgical: breach of protocol, violation of privacy, hostile work environment. Vespera read it over his shoulder. They're demanding a retraction. They're giving you until tonight to take the list down, or the no-confidence vote happens at the council meeting tonight. Maceo folded the letter in half and set it on the desk. Then let them vote. Outside, the crowd had doubled in size. The air was electric, thick with the scent of change. A new sign had appeared near the chalk art on the cafe. The list is the truth. We are watching. The wall outside the copper kettle had become a gallery of grievances. Amidst the flowers and chalk, a woman in her late 60s named Marisol stepped toward the velvet rope line. She carried no poster, only a small, silver-framed photograph of a young man. My son filed a complaint against one of those men 4 years ago, she said, her voice carrying through the uncharacteristic silence of the crowd. It vanished. Like it never happened. Today, I saw that officer's name on Commissioner Solari's list. Thank you, Maceo. Maceo stepped out of the precinct to meet her. They didn't embrace, and they didn't shake hands, they simply stood in the shared space of a long-delayed truth. It was a recognition of a debt finally being acknowledged. Inside the precinct, however, the air was toxic. A captain threw a chair in the break room. Rookies were refusing to pair up with anyone named on the list. But then came the first crack in the wall of silence. Officer Lachlan Drax, one of the 7 named, requested a private audience with Maceo. When he sat down, Drax didn't lead with excuses. I was reckless, he admitted, staring at his boots. I thought the badge made me invisible to the law. I thought no one was watching. I deserved the review. Maceo watched him through a shroud of skepticism. Why tell me this now, Lachlan? Because, Drax said, finally looking up, maybe this department finally has a shot at being the shield it pretends to be. That night, Odelia Solari appeared on a local broadcast. She sat in her library, hands folded over a silk shawl, her eyes as steady as a heartbeat. My son is not a perfect man, she told the anchor, but what he is doing matters. Because the only thing more dangerous than a crime is the pretense that it never happened. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. But by the time the segment ended, the anchor was visibly shaken, and the clip was being translated into 5 different languages across the globe. The backlash was immediate: vandalism at the station, anonymous threats, and digital campaigns calling Maceo a class traitor. But for every stone thrown, 5 more hands reached out to catch it. At 11:42 p.m., Maceo sat alone in his office. A thin, cream-colored envelope had been slid under his door. Inside was a report from 2017, a missing audio file and a name that had been scrubbed from the initial audit. A sticky note was attached: you missed the worst one. Tomorrow, Maceo whispered to the empty room as Lieutenant Vespera walked in, we start again. There's an 8th name. The 8th name was Corporal Silas Marden. Marden hadn't been on the original list of 7, but the documents inside the envelope suggested he should have been the first. The file detailed 3 incidents spanning half a decade: fabrication of evidence, excessive force against a minor, and an unjustified detention. All 3 had been resolved internally, a euphemism for being buried in the garden of the old regime. Maceo spent the early hours of the morning in the basement archives. He moved past the dented cabinets to a box marked K-Series, 2015 to 2020. Deep inside, buried under radio logs and faded photos, was a disc, TR Stop/November 2nd/2017/Officer Martin. He took it to the oldest desktop in the squad room, the only one with a functional disk drive. The video flickered to life. No audio. A black sedan pulled over on a desolate rural road. 11:41 p.m. Corporal Martin approached the car. The driver, a young man, rolled his window down. There was no dialogue, but Martin's body language was a snarl. He hauled the boy out and slammed him against the trunk. The passenger door opened, a teenage girl, her face a mask of frozen terror. Martin screamed at her, then the dashcam went to static. Maceo froze the frame on the girl's face. He knew those eyes. By 9 a.m., Corporal Martin was in the review room. He didn't sit. He stood with his arms crossed, his posture an arrogant challenge. "You recognize the date, Silas?" Maceo asked, sliding the disc across the table. Martin shrugged. It was a traffic stop. Minor violation. No big deal. The footage says otherwise, Vespera added, sliding the maintenance logs forward. You claimed your dashcam malfunctioned that night. But the logs show it was in perfect working order before and after that stop. The next morning, the blowback went nuclear. The police union sent an open letter to every major outlet in the state. It was a masterpiece of corporate gaslighting, accusing Maceo of creating a hostile work environment, targeting respected veterans without due process, and sacrificing departmental morale on the altar of political optics. Talk radio was a bonfire of hot takes. He's making it about identity when it's about law and order. He's punishing heroes to look good for the cameras. Maceo watched it all unfold from his office. He didn't tweet. He didn't counterpunch. He simply kept turning pages in the archives. In the middle of this storm, Odelia Solari made her first public appearance. She didn't hold a rally, she simply walked into a community meeting in a church basement downtown. It was a humble room, folding chairs, the smell of damp coats and floor wax. Teachers, barbers, and students sat in a circle. Odelia sat quietly, listening as a young man asked, "Do you think anything's really going to change, or is this just a week of headlines?" Odelia cleared her throat. The room went so silent you could hear the radiator hiss. "I was humiliated in a place where I thought I was a neighbor," she said, her voice small but resonant. But what came after? This part right here? This is the beginning of the change. Not because it's loud, but because for the first time in my 70 years, people are finally, truly listening. The applause started as a single clap and grew into a roar. For the first time in weeks, the pressure in Maceo's chest eased. It wasn't just noise, it was momentum. By Friday, the union was pushing for a formal vote of no confidence. Tamsin Morris slipped into Maceo's office with a grim look. "They're counting heads, Chief. If they get a majority, they'll take the vote to the city council to force your removal." Maceo nodded. "Let them. You don't care?" "I care," Maceo said, leaning back. "But I'm not scared of a room full of men who are afraid of their own shadows." That night, he stayed late and drafted a personal letter to every officer on the force. "If holding each other accountable feels like betrayal," he wrote, "then we have forgotten what service means. I will not protect a culture of silence. I will protect this city, with or without your permission." By sunrise, the city was bracing for impact. At 6:45 a.m., Maceo walked out of his office with a thin manila folder. He didn't go to the briefing room. He walked to the public bulletin board just beside the precinct's front doors, the one usually reserved for most wanted posters and lost dog flyers. He pinned a single sheet of paper to the board. Beneath the header were 7 names, 7 badge numbers, and the specific dates of the suppressed complaints. At the very bottom, in his own sharp, cursive handwriting, he had added, "No justice without truth. No trust without transparency." The door clicked shut behind him. By 7:02 a.m., a passerby stopped to read it. By 7:30 a.m., the photo was global. By 8 a.m., Elowen was officially on fire. Inside the station, the silence fractured. Officers watched through the glass lobby as a crowd began to form, citizens with phones, signs, and coffee cups. An elderly woman pressed her palm against the paper as if it were a holy relic. Lieutenant Vespera arrived minutes later, her pace frantic. "Maceo, the media is swarming. Protesters are blocking the north entrance. And some of the guys on the floor are threatening to walk out right now." "Let them," Maceo said, leaning against the front desk. "I've got your back, but you need to know, this is national now. Channel 9, the major networks, they're calling this the list. I'm not hiding from it." At 9:03 a.m., Maceo stepped into the lobby. The flashbulbs were blinding. Reporters shouted over one another, but he waited for the noise to die down. "Yes, I authorized the list," he said, his voice cutting through the din. "No, I am not sorry. And if protecting the people of Elowen costs me favor with those who abuse their badge, then so be it." A reporter from the local Herald yelled, "Commissioner, doesn't this undermine officer morale?" Maceo paused, a dry, sharp smile touching his lips. "Morale built on silence isn't morale, Mr. Reed. It's complicity." At 11:17 a.m., Sergeant Cashin Manley, 12 years on the force, walked to the front desk. He didn't do it quietly. He unclipped his badge and slammed it onto the counter. He walked out the front door, straight into the waiting microphones. "I didn't sign up to be crucified for paperwork," he shouted. "This isn't policing, it's a witch hunt." Someone in the crowd booed, someone else clapped. Maceo watched from his window, unblinking. At 7 a.m., Maceo Solari turned the heavy iron key to the department's basement archives. The scent hit him before the light did, the cloying aroma of decaying paper, stagnant dust, and the metallic tang of institutional neglect. The room was a subterranean tomb, lit only by high, barred windows that filtered the morning sun into hesitant, gray streaks. Rows of dented, olive-drab filing cabinets stretched across the cracked concrete. Most hadn't been touched since the turn of the decade. Maceo ran a hand along a drawer labeled Internal Correspondence, unresolved, his fingers tracing a path through years of intentional silence. This was where the truth lived, not in the press releases or the shiny commendations upstairs, but here, in the dark, buried under layers of procedural red tape. He pulled the first drawer, the metal screamed, a jagged sound like a beast waking from a long, forced slumber. Inside was a sea of manila folders. Each one was a ghost. By 9 a.m., the catacombs had been transformed. Internal Affairs had set up a perimeter of folding tables and portable scanners. Officer Tierney, a woman whose exhaustion was written in the sharp lines around her mouth, approached Maceo with a heavy clipboard. "We're looking at a systemic failure, Commissioner," Tierney said, her voice echoing off the low ceiling. "I've done a preliminary count. There are 214 unresolved civilian complaints from the last 5 years alone. Roughly 38% of them were never even assigned an investigator, they were simply marked intake complete and moved to the basement." Maceo felt a cold fury settle in his marrow. "Start sorting by name. I want a heat map of every officer with more than 3 flags. If a supervisor signed off on a dismissal without a witness interview, flag them too." Within 2 hours, the rot had a face. 23 cases were highlighted in neon yellow. 7 of those involved a tight-knit circle of officers, and 3 were linked to supervisors who had effectively investigated themselves. By noon, the precinct's atmosphere had curdled. 3 officers had already submitted resignation letters via email, 4 others had requested immediate early retirement. One sergeant stood in the break room, loudly decrying the political theater to anyone who would listen. Maceo didn't flinch. He walked past the noise, stopping only when Officer Joss, a young recruit who usually kept his head down, blocked his path. "They're going to burn the house down before they let you clean it, sir," Joss whispered. "Then we'll build a new one on the ashes," Maceo replied. That afternoon, Odelia Solari sat by her garden window. She wore a dress of deep plum, her silver hair pinned back with a tortoiseshell comb. She looked serene, but there was a distance in her gaze, the look of someone who had traveled back to a time she'd worked hard to forget. The doorbell chimed. Her neighbor led in a young girl with intricate braids, clutching a bunch of wilting daisies. "Mrs. Solari," the girl said, her voice small. "My name is Lyra. I'm the one who filmed the officer at the cafe." Odelia looked at her for a long beat. She didn't speak immediately. She simply gestured to the cushioned bench beside her. Lyra sat, nervously twisting the flower stems. "I didn't mean to make you a target," Lyra whispered, her eyes brimming. I couldn't let him get away with it. I thought if people saw, maybe things would change." Odelia reached out, her hand steady and warm, and squeezed the girl's fingers. "You gave the truth a witness, Lyra. That is a heavy burden for one so young, but you carried it well. Do not apologize for being the light." As evening bled into night, Maceo met Sergeant Eris at a dimly lit diner on the edge of the district. Eris was a legend, 30 years on the force, decorated and weary. He was already halfway through a slice of cherry pie when Maceo slid into the booth. "You're digging through the graveyard, Maceo," Eris said, not looking up. "And some of those bodies belong to men this town calls saints." "I'm not looking for saints," Maceo said. "I'm looking for the truth." Eris finally looked up, his eyes clouded with regret. "I was there when the doors to those archives were locked. I didn't fight hard enough to keep them open. I thought I was protecting the Brotherhood. I was just protecting the rot." He slid a thick, unmarked envelope across the laminate table. "Names. Dates. Private notes I kept when the official ones were shredded. Use them. Clear the termites out before the whole structure falls on the people we're supposed to protect." Maceo took the envelope. "Thank you, Eris. Don't thank me yet. You're making enemies who smile at you in the hallway and sharpen their knives in the dark." At 10 p.m., Maceo sat with Lieutenant Vespera. Stacks of files, Eris's notes, and the digital audit logs were spread out like a map of a war zone. His mother hadn't left her home since he'd dropped her off. She hadn't answered her phone. The medics said she was physically sound, just a minor first-degree burn, but her total withdrawal worried him more than any riot. At 8 a.m., a line of residents began to form outside the station. They didn't carry picket signs, they carried space. They stood in a long, silent queue, grandmothers, students, shopkeepers. Many held ceramic mugs of coffee, a quiet, symbolic rebuke. By 9:30 a.m., there were over 200 people. No chanting. Just a wall of human witnesses. Inside, Maceo addressed his senior staff. "I want full, unmitigated cooperation with the internal audit. Anyone who attempts to obstruct, even with a shrug or a deleted email, will be stripped of their credentials by noon." A veteran sergeant, Garrick, shifted in his seat. "Sir, we've served this town a long time. Some of us think you're being a bit reactionary." Maceo didn't blink. "I'm being corrective, Garrick. There's a difference. I've initiated an external review of every use of force report from the last 5 years. Every civilian complaint that was lost or filed away without a signature is being reopened." Garrick exhaled a heavy, cynical breath. "You're going to find ghosts. Then I'll buy them shovels," Maceo countered. By midday, Mayor Kestrel arrived for an unscheduled meeting. Kestrel was a man who wore expensive suits like armor and spoke in polished, non-committal paragraphs. "Maceo," the mayor began, closing the door softly. "I think we can agree the optics on this have become unmanageable." Maceo didn't stand. "The optics, Mr. Mayor? You mean the truth caught on 4K video?" Kestrel sighed, leaning against the desk. You're being emotional. It's understandable. She's your mother. But we need to control the narrative before the State Budget Committee gets nervous. I'm not interested in a narrative, Maceo said, leaning forward. I'm thinking about the next woman who walks into a public space and wonders if the man in uniform is there to protect her or humiliate her. I'm thinking about the sons who aren't in a position to fix it. Kestrel's eyes narrowed. You're going to make a lot of enemies in this building, Maceo. People who have long memories. Then let them step into the light so I can see their faces, Maceo replied. Across town, in a house that smelled of lavender and old books, Odelia Solari sat in her sunroom. The seafoam blouse had been scrubbed, but she couldn't bring herself to wear it. Her neighbor, Sia Vesper, sat across from her with a pot of herbal tea. I saw the news, Odelia, Sia said softly. The whole world is talking about you. Odelia looked out at the garden. I don't want to be talked about, Sia. I just wanted to finish my sketch. Sia leaned in. Do you remember when Maceo was 5? That summer the developers tried to tear down the community park? You stood in front of the bulldozers with a book and a chair. You didn't say a word then, either. Odelia's mouth twitched into the ghost of a smile. They didn't have cameras back then. They just had me. And now, Sia whispered, you have everyone. At 2:45 p.m., an encrypted email landed in Maceo's inbox. The subject line was simply, Vance's ledger. It contained no text, only 3 attachments: civilian complaints from his previous county, a suppressed report of a similar incident with a street performer, and a memo from a trainee who had been threatened after reporting Vance's conduct. Maceo printed every page. He called the internal affairs lead. Reopen the Vance file. And tag every officer who signed off on his exemplary evaluations. This isn't an isolated incident, it's a pattern of protection. At 5 p.m., Maceo stood before the cameras once more. The crowd had doubled. My name is Maceo Solari, he began, his voice echoing off the brick walls of the square. And I am here to tell you that this is not a moment. It is a reckoning. He held up the folder of suppressed complaints. These are the voices that were buried. They didn't have a video. They didn't have a commissioner for a son. But they mattered. He looked directly into the lens. If you're watching this and thinking this only matters because of who she was, ask yourself why justice only arrives when there's a badge involved. My mother taught me to speak the truth even when my voice shakes. Today, I'm speaking for everyone whose voice was forced into silence. As dusk settled, the crowd didn't disperse. Instead, they began to light candles. Children passed out small cards with a single line printed on them, witness the silence. Across the window of the copper kettle, someone had scrawled in thick, white chalk, she didn't need to raise her voice because the world finally found its own. He watched the coffee fall. He watched his mother's face, the woman who had worked 3 jobs to put him through the academy, the woman who had never once raised her hand in anger. He saw her dignity remain intact while the man wearing the same uniform he wore acted like a common thug. Maceo stood. He didn't grab his hat. He didn't call a press conference. He simply walked to the elevator. The officers in the hallway parted like the Red Sea, the air in the building seemed to drop 20 degrees as he passed. He arrived at the Elowen precinct just as Vance was bragging to a fellow deputy about clearing out the clutter at the cafe. Deputy Vance, Maceo's voice echoed, cold and hollow. Vance jumped, his face instantly draining of color. Commissioner. I didn't expect you down here today. I imagine you didn't, Maceo said, stepping into the light. He held up a printout of the video's most viral frame, Odelia, drenched but defiant. Tell me, Kaylin. In what chapter of the field manual does it describe the tactical application of scalding liquid to a 70-year-old woman? Sir, she was being uncooperative. She was sitting, Maceo interrupted, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a shout. She was existing. And you decided that her existence was an inconvenience to your ego. You didn't see a citizen. You didn't even see a human. You saw a nobody you thought you could break. Maceo reached out and unclipped the badge from Vance's chest with a sharp, metallic click. You're finished here. Not because she's my mother, though that was a remarkably poor gamble on your part, but because you've proven that you cannot be trusted with the weight of this metal. Internal Affairs will handle the assault charges. Hand over your service weapon. By 5 p.m., the precinct's official statement was released. It didn't offer excuses. It offered a total overhaul of the department's disciplinary board. That evening, the copper kettle was quiet again. Odelia sat in her velvet chair, now wearing a fresh sweater of deep indigo. Beside her sat Maceo, 2 fresh coffees between them. They didn't talk about the video or the millions of people watching. They simply sat in the silence, the kind of silence that follows a storm, when the air is finally clear. Odelia Solari was trending on the global feed by nightfall. Digital painters rendered her silhouette against the cafe window, a study in silver hair and stained silk. Writers shared prose about the weight of the quiet, and teachers posted about their own mothers, their own histories of swallowed pride. It was no longer just about one rogue officer, it was about every calculated indignity that had ever passed without a witness. By 6 p.m., a major network picked up the story. Archivist assaulted by local deputy turns out to be mother of the state's youngest commissioner. The news anchor, a woman named Alara Vox, stared into the camera with a look of tempered fury. I'm not sure what's more arresting, she said, the cruelty of the act, or the bone-deep grace with which Odelia Solari endured it. At 7:15 p.m., Maceo Solari stepped in front of a single, flickering microphone outside the Elowen precinct. He didn't carry a binder. He didn't have a teleprompter. My name is Maceo Solari. I served this district as commissioner, and I was raised by the woman you all saw in that footage. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the silent crowd. She didn't ask for this spotlight. She never raised her voice in that cafe. But what was done to her was a rot, not just to her person, but to the oath we take. He leaned into the microphone, his knuckles white as they gripped the edges of the podium. To anyone watching, this isn't just about one deputy and a cup of coffee. It's about a system that ignores small violences until they are forced into the light by a camera lens. His voice remained steady, but his jaw was a jagged line of granite. I will not allow this department to be a sanctuary for cowards hiding behind tin stars. He stepped back as the press erupted into a cacophony of questions. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The story had outgrown him. The sun hadn't yet broken over the Elowen skyline when the clip surpassed 6 million views. A poet in London performed a spoken-word piece over the footage, a mother in Seattle wrote a thread titled The Cost of Being Calm. But inside the Elowen precinct, the air was stagnant. It was the kind of pressurized quiet that follows a landslide, everyone waiting to see what else would crumble. Maceo sat behind his desk, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in his eyes as he scrolled through the tidal wave of public sentiment. Protect the elders. If she wasn't the commissioner's mother, would he even care? Justice shouldn't require a bloodline. It wasn't the searing heat of the espresso that made her breath hitch, it was the suffocating stillness that followed. There was no collective gasp, no frantic rush for napkins, just the rhythmic, wet thud of dark liquid soaking into her seafoam-colored silk and the distant, rhythmic chime of a teaspoon hitting a saucer. It felt as though the world had collectively decided to look away while a man in a crisp uniform methodically stripped a stranger of her dignity. Her blouse darkened in an expanding, jagged map of brown. The coffee tracked a burning path down her collarbone, but she remained a statue. She didn't cry out. She didn't even blink. She simply looked at him, not with the wide-eyed terror he clearly expected, but with a weary, clinical recognition. She had seen this brand of small-mindedness before, she had spent a lifetime navigating it. Across the room, tucked into a corner stool, a lanky teenager named Zev gripped his smartphone. He didn't lower the lens. He captured the steam rising from her chest, the glint of the sunlight on the officer's nameplate, and the predatory smirk that hadn't yet realized its own expiration date. What happened next would travel far beyond the walls of the copper kettle. It would bypass the petty grievances of a small-town precinct and strike at the heart of the state's capital. Because the woman in the ruined silk wasn't just a patron, she was the architect of the very man currently rewriting the department's future. The copper kettle sat on the jagged edge of Elowen Square, a narrow, ivy-choked building where the air always smelled of toasted cardamom and old newsprint. It was a sanctuary for the precise. Odelia Solari, a 70-year-old retired botanical archivist, was the most precise of them all. Every Thursday at 8:20 a.m., she occupied the velvet armchair in the north corner. She wore sensible loafers, carried a leather-bound log of local flora, and ordered a single-origin roast, black, no frills. To the locals, Odelia was a fixture of grace, the woman who left hand-drawn thank-you notes for the mail carrier and could identify any weed by its root structure. Then came Deputy Kalen Vance. Vance wasn't a local. He had drifted in from a neighboring county with a chip on his shoulder the size of a riot shield. He walked with a heavy-booted swagger that seemed designed to rattle the porcelain on the shelves. He viewed the badge not as a heavy responsibility, but as a skeleton key to every door in town. That morning, Vance wanted the north corner. He wanted the velvet chair. He stood over Odelia, his shadow eclipsing her notebook. "Move it, Grandma. I need the outlet for my laptop," Vance grunted. Odelia looked up, her silver hair catching the light. "Good morning, officer. There are several open tables near the hearth. I've been seated here for 20 minutes, and I'd prefer to finish my study." Vance's face contorted. He didn't like being told no, especially not by someone he perceived as invisible. He leaned down, his voice a low, jagged blade. "I wasn't asking. I'm telling you how the seating chart works today." When Odelia didn't move, when she simply returned to her sketch of a wild orchid, Vance snapped. He didn't shout. He reached out, took her steaming mug, and tilted his wrist. The coffee cascaded over her shoulder in a slow, deliberate insult. The cafe went graveyard silent. Odelia stood, the wet silk clinging to her skin. She didn't yell. She reached for a linen napkin and patted her collar. "You've made a catastrophic error in judgment, Deputy," she said, her voice like grinding stones. Vance let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "What are you gonna do? File a report?" "I am the report." Behind him, Zev's thumb hit upload. He didn't need to say a word. He just pointed a trembling finger at the community board by the exit. There, nestled among flyers for lost kittens and bake sales, was a high-resolution portrait of the new Commissioner of Police, Maceo Solari. The caption read, "Dedicated to Odelia Solari, who taught me that true strength requires no volume." The digital wildfire began at 9:15 a.m. By 10 a.m., the video had been shared 142,000 times. By noon, the view count hit 4.8 million. The hashtag the silent stain wasn't just a trend, it was a rallying cry. It captured the raw, unedited footage of a man in power bullying a woman who represented everyone's mother, everyone's grandmother, and everyone's conscience. At the district headquarters, Commissioner Maceo Solari sat in a glass-walled office. He was a man of few words and immense presence. When his assistant, a panicked young man named Rune, sprinted in and slid a tablet across the mahogany desk, Maceo didn't move for a full minute.